Okay, so I was at the University of Strathclyde in Glasgow, and I was an undergraduate there, and that's where I did my master's and I did my PhD there. And as part of your undergraduate degree, we do a 4-year undergraduate degree in Scotland, and as part of that you must do a dissertation. So you must do like 12,000 word research project.
Okay.
And that was a real turning point for me. I mean, I absolutely loved all of my undergraduate classes, but having that research project that was completely mine, and for the first time having to define a question, a set a question that made research sense, was really a hugely challenging experience. And so the topic of that dissertation was mad cow's disease and the regulation of scientific advice in the European Union over that controversy, and how they handled the relationship with the United Kingdom, whose scientists were saying slightly different things. And that introduced me to lots of different theories, theories about risk and risk society, so Ulrich Beck, but also to epistemic communities by Peter Haas. And through doing that research and having to integrate concepts and empirics, which I really enjoyed, and I thought I think I'm quite good at that. I think I can work out how to gather data and how to make it work with theory, and then work out actually where does a concept have a weakness, or where can I add something here. So that was so important to me, and of course, but like most academics, the reason that I thought I could do a PhD after having had that experience was because my supervisor at the time, who is Professor Laura Cram, who's now at Edinburgh University, she told me I could. She said, I think you've got something special here. I think, if you wanted to be an academic and you wanted to look at that career, that's something you should consider. So that kind of really early mentoring and somebody initiating that conversation with me was incredibly important. So, I mean, the theory that was most important really for the first, my PhD and then the first kind of few years of academic life was epistemic communities. So I did a lot of, my thesis was about scientific advice in the European Union, looking at 2 empirical case studies, and a lot of my theoretical work involved looking at epistemic communities and trying to work out how to identify them in the first place, and then adding on bits of sociology, so adding on some of the risk literature, some of the old literature about science and society and about technocracy. But the core piece of work I was trying to do was try to add some kind of sense of causal mechanisms involved in epistemic communities, and also make it more of a framework that could be used in public policy, because of course Haas was interested in international relations and an interest in the role of networks of experts globally, and coordinating policy across lots and lots of countries, whereas I was more interested in nation versus nation kind of expertise. But that's the one that was most important for the first part of my career. And then what I've developed since then, with Claudio Radelli, one of my colleagues at Exeter, is a focus on the learning mechanism. So that's what I worked through in my PhD. So what are these networks of experts doing? How are they triggering learning? What is it to learn? How can you identify learning in public policy? And that was all about epistemic, the epistemic world. And since then, I've branched out and kind of broadened that out and said, actually, can we really say that policy learning could be a theoretical approach that you could use regardless of the issue, that you could use across the policy process? If you think about Sabatier and Chris Weibel's book, Theories of the Policy Process, and that gives us the kind of, the big master theories. Policy learning is not in there. I mean, it's in there in terms of, it's part of the Advocacy Coalition framework, so it's in some of the theories, but it's not a standalone theory. So that's the kind of project just now which I could trace right back to the start whenever I was looking at epistemic communities and trying to work out the causal mechanisms that were important there. I would contact more academics, more established academics. When I did my PhD, I mean, I was lucky. I was at Strathclyde University at a time whenever it was a real public policy powerhouse. So I was getting to, read the latest research, conference drafts of papers by people like Jerry Stoker, Jean-Pierre, Brian Hogwood, David Judge, Laura Cram. So I was really privileged in being at Strathclyde, and we had a good graduate student culture and quite an active, paper giving culture, and we tested each other. We were tough on each other in the way that lots of graduate students are. But what I didn't do was I didn't make much contact with academics beyond that orbit of Strathclyde. And I thought a lot about that, about why that was, and I think I was really deferential. This was my dream, right? To be a PhD student and to be a funded PhD student was just brilliant. I was working with all these people who I respected massively and who taught me, and I was then getting to teach on their classes. It's big, it's a big thing. So I think I was really deferential, and the idea that I would have dropped an email to a senior scholar whose work I had read and had impressed me, I would just never have done that. And I was going to national conferences, but I didn't have the funds to go to international conferences, so I wasn't ever in a social situation. So that's always my advice to my PhD students now is, if you've read something that you want to follow up on, or you've got a question about, make contact, because we're a community. And you really learn that when you get, deep into this, and if you make a career of it, that you're mixing with the same people all the time. And that's what's great about all these conferences that we go to, is we're sharing and we're learning together and we're working together. And if I had the guts to reach out, then I think I would have got even more. But I say I was lucky. I was lucky at Strathclyde. I had all these great mentors. But I think that's what I would do differently. There's nothing else that I think I would change. Graduate student life is full of insecurities and excitements, but that's right. I think that's as it should be. That's part of the stage. But reaching out to other people, definitely.
That's great.
Whenever I was an undergraduate, Laura Cram, who supervised that dissertation I talked about, she was really important because she was somebody who I always felt better when I came out of her office than I had whenever I went in. Yeah, if I had an intellectual curiosity or I was uncertain about something, I always felt comfortable enough to just lay it all out there and display all my ignorance, which is really important, that someone creates an atmosphere and a space where you can do that, and then they can help, right, and they can suggest things and make you think about things in a different way. And she was really important in that, and she also she told me that she thought I could do it, and she was somebody who I massively look up to, and she was very important. And since then, my PhD supervisor, David Judge, he was fantastic, and he was a great person to lock horns with. He's not so much a mainstream public policy scholar. David is a parliamentary scholar, so he was a great person to have supervising my public policy work, because he was really sceptical of all kind of policy networks, epistemic communities types of ideas, because his focus is Parliament and the legislative process and legislators and the power that they hold. So he was really important to lock horns with, and pushed me a lot. And since then, Claudio Radelli has been my professional mentor, my research partner in lots of ways. He was my external examiner, so he examined my PhD thesis, and he has been a huge champion of mine. Especially throughout the first years of my career, which are, they're always the hardest, getting that first faculty position, and then working out what on earth you're meant to be doing with, spinning all the plates of teaching and admin and also getting published. So he's been brilliantly important, and, it's a dream getting to work with somebody like him every day and getting to run a workshop with him. So yeah, I've had lots.
Great.
So the concept was originally formulated by Peter Haas, and I know that Ernest Haas did do some work on it, but from a more organisational point of view. But Peter Haas's work was really thinking about these networks of experts who were often linked globally. So he was coming from an international relations tradition, and he was interested in, well, what kind of power do these agents have in cases that are especially technically complex or where political preferences are unclear. So he's looking at cases where these groups of actors are able to insinuate themselves into the bureaucracy sometimes, and into the policy process, and are needed. They're needed to teach policymakers what to do in an issue and how to understand it. So incredibly powerful. And this was the first political science, international relations framework that really put the spotlight on the role of experts in an organised way, and didn't just say these are epiphenomenal or they're an add-on. He really put them centre stage and pushed that agenda to look at the power that they have, because they have control over knowledge production. And I think that is incredibly important. And where the work has gone now, the main drawback with epistemic communities as an approach is that empirically they are they can be quite hard to identify, and they can be quite hard to trace, because you have to be willing to stick with it for quite a long time if you're going to be able to see what is the political influence of these actors. Because it's very, very easy to do a short case study where you say, well, in the end they're just one actor among many. So really you have to, I think with epistemic communities, you have to be willing to get into your case study and be in it for the long haul, to see all of the way that their influence waxes and wanes. But I think it remains a very important framework. I think it's quite a hard one to use, because finding the empirical case studies can be tricky. And Haas did a fantastic job, because some of he had the case study of the Mediterranean Sea, and the United Nations Environment Plan around that. He also had the CFC's case study. So he had and the Montreal Protocol. So he had some fantastic case studies that completely were like the ideal type, and demonstrated the ideal type of epistemic community. But there's been a lot of work since then which has moved beyond just the environmental area and has looked at foreign policy, for example, trade policy, economic development. So there's lots of scope in it. But I think it was the first one to really spotlight the organisation of networks, and that they are political actors, whether they admit to it or not. Well, I think you just need to look at, climate change is the obvious example, right? You just need to look at the absolutely massive impact of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. It's been hugely, hugely influential and important. And that's something that started as a group of experts saying, we need to find a way of getting together and codifying our knowledge, because that's really powerful. Working out what our methods are, agreeing what they are together, and creating their own bureaucracy, really, which is so powerful in terms of the control they have over knowledge, that decision makers and governments cannot ignore it. They cannot ignore it, because there is something, there is a real life policy problem that affects people's everyday lives, especially in the global south, but increasingly now. And there's a group of scientists who control a huge amount of knowledge, which is key to making public policy. So that's the most obvious example, right? It's the biggest one. But you can look at much smaller scale ones, but the increased proliferation of epistemic methodologies and technologies just in policy making. Think about regulatory impact assessment, the use of evaluation, United States, certainly the use of cost benefit analysis. A lot of this is powered not just by bureaucratic choices, but it's powered by expert communities who are creating those methodologies and are able to get involved in the bureaucracy and use them. Learning has got a really huge history in public policy literature. Right back to John Dewey, Harold Lasswell, Charles Lindblom talked about it, and of course the most celebrated study is the Hugh Heckel book in the 1974. So it's got this great pedigree, right, of political scientists and public policy scholars saying, hey, don't just focus on hard power and interests or on formal structures and institutions. There's something else cognitive that goes on here, and something ideational that goes on. So we've got a long history of kicking this idea of learning around. So we had this first wave kind of post-war of scholars just waving a flag and saying, look, this is important. And then in the 1990s we had this renewed interest with people like Bennett and Howlett in particular, Peter May, who started to really try and put together taxonomies of different types of policy learning that have been empirically observed. So that has been really important work. And now I think we're having a kind of third wave of interest in policy learning, where people like Claudio and I and many others are trying to say, okay, so we have this big literature now, we need to systematize it, we need to actually sit down and work out what have we learned from all this work in policy learning, but also try and push it further in terms of methods and measurement. And also try and answer some of those arguments about the kind of try and silo policy learning off as if it's not an argument that has any power implications. You know, this is one of the recurring criticisms of policy learning as an analytical device or as a causal mechanism, is that this is all just basically kind of soft stuff which is about socialization, it's about things that it's actually very difficult to observe. We all think it's there, it's all about motherhood and apple pie, but really it's not where the hard stuff's going on, it's not, you know, determining any bottom line. And I think that's some of the work that Claudio and I have been trying to do, is to try and open up the idea of policy learning and say, okay, so yes, empirically we observe lots of learning stories which are epistemic, so that kind of rational, evidence-based public policy, but there's more. You can think about learning which is hierarchical, which is built into the system, built into institutions. You can also think about, and this is always the most problematic category, the kind of idea that you can learn through bargaining, so through repeated interactions. That's not just a powering interest-based process, that's a learning process that's going on there. And that talks a lot to kind of classic Lindblom work about intelligence of democracy, that the more that we learn how to adjust, and the more that we have repeated interactions, we're learning here. We're not just hard bargaining, there's a learning process going on there as well. And then finally we can think about much bigger reflexive learning, where society gets involved in problems that are loosely defined or extremely contested, and there isn't an obvious institution, there isn't hierarchy, or there isn't an obvious set of experts who can help you out. So this is really for society to have a big debate about. So we've tried to open up the concept a bit, and this is all drawing on the literature and what we've actually found that scholars have empirically observed. So that's where I think the literature is at. I think it's in a really good place, but the big frontier and the big challenge is to do something on measurement and with the methods. It's incredibly difficult, because more than any part of public policy analysis, I think that policy learning is the home of the single case study. I suppose that this again goes back to what all of our forefathers in policy sciences said. You know, Lasswell is a prime example of making knowledge which is usable and used in some kind of way. And I do think that all scholars are involved in producing social goods. And I mean, the biggest impact we'll ever have is in teaching, right? That is the biggest social good we produce, and that's right. But we have all these research findings that it would be really useful for the powerful or the well-connected or the less powerful and disadvantaged to know about, to empower themselves. So, you know, I do a lot of work with different government agencies, and sometimes that is fruitful work, sometimes that's work where I feel like I'm getting listened to, and other times it's not. Other times it's me trying to knock at a door and share my research with them. But I think it's always useful to try and create a space where you're getting policymakers and other stakeholders who are not in academia to reflect on the gaps in their evidence and to talk to you about how you can help and you know, how you can share. And I do think that younger scholars need to be thinking about the impact they have in a non-academic way, because you're at the cutting edge, right? You know, you're the ones who are creating the knowledge frames and the empirical evidence, you know, that we'll all be studying for the next 20 years. So, you know, forming the kind of impact habit early, I think, is really important. and it's something that we need more mentoring to help people do, to go out there and reach out, not just to policymakers, but to NGOs, to think tanks, to charities, and to share. Well, you need to think about what motivates you, right, as a human being and as a scholar. So in scholarly terms, you know, are you somebody who's interested in making a normative contribution? Is it all about methods for you? Is it teaching? Is it translational push that interests you? Is it conceptual work? You know, or is it being in the field? Is empirics and organising your empirics and you know, connecting with data? So you need to think about what motivates you. But you also need to talk, you need to seek mentoring. And that comes back to something we talked about earlier about, you know, that's a big regret of mine, that I didn't make more contact with people beyond my graduate school. And I think that it's behoving on academics to be completely approachable and open and ready for that and ready to encourage people. You know, graduate students need more mentoring opportunities so that they can puzzle this stuff out with other people who have been there before and ask themselves the same question. And also remember, this doesn't stop, right? This isn't a one-shot question you ask yourself at the start of your graduate career. Right throughout your research career, you will have punctuations, you'll have moments where you say, what's my contribution? You know, and you can change direction. The most exciting scholars are always ones who are changing direction, shifting focus. They don't get locked into the same thing. They're willing to branch out and question themselves and think again, update their methods if they need to, you know, follow a research passion that they haven't managed to do. So it's not just a one-shot thing at one point in your career.